All right, welcome to Module 1 of the Python Essential 1 course. My name is Joseph Law, and I'll always be your instructor for this course. So, this Module 1 simply just introduces us to Python and computer programming in general. So, we just go straight into it. So, these are just basic concepts in computer science. You talk about programming, program, and programming language. So when we talk about programming is simply just the process of writing computer codes that performs a task, right? And after this is done, it's usually leads to what we call an end product, and this end product it's the program. For example, when you look at, let me say, the Microsoft Office Word, which is a word processing application, the process in which that program was created is what we call programming. The process in which someone sat down probably somewhere in the world, on his computer, putting together lines of code, thousands of codes to create Microsoft Office Word is what we call programming. Then at the end of doing that, the end product is what we call a program. So one thing you need to understand is that our computer does not understand our own language, the natural language. We'll soon get into that. So since computer does not understand our natural language, this is what brings about programming language. So a programming language is a bridge between a computer and a programmer. A programming language allows a programmer to specify instructions that a computer is to execute. So there are two basic concepts that we're going to be looking at here, which is syntax and semantics. So when we talk about syntax, syntax refers to the rules and regulation concerning how a code should be written. Now, this just look basically just see it in terms of a guideline, right? There are rules. That means these rules must be followed. So semantics, on the other hand, just look at the meaning of the written code. I always look at semantics in terms of logic, right? Logic of your code. So if your logic is wrong, then we are talking about semantic error. So we'll get into that right now. So now a syntax error and semantics error are two key concepts you always come across. Uh, as a programmer, you definitely come across syntax error a lot, and also semantic error. So now a syntax error occurs when there's a violation of the rules of a programming language. It's just the same thing we are saying here, right? So every programming language has its own syntax. Very important thing you need to understand. Every programming language has its own syntax, but when we talk about semantic error on the other hand, semantics error occur irrespective of the programming language you are using. So in essence, what we're saying is that if your logic is wrong, even if you are using JavaScript, C++, or C, Ruby on Rails, or whatever programming language you're using out there, if your logic is wrong, you will end up with what we call a semantic error, irrespective of the programming language you're using. So, but when we talk about syntax error occur based on the kind of programming language you're using. So, when you are working with Python, if you encounter a syntax error, it differs when you are working with JavaScript because every programming language has its own different syntax. So, we'll move further to what we call natural language, as I was saying before, and machine language. So now, natural language is our own mother tongue, right? Like the English language most of us speak. So this is our own natural language. So machine language, on the other hand, is the mother tongue for the computer, right? A computer does not understand natural language. So we human does not understand machine language. So the need for an intermediary language becomes a necessity, and this is where high-level programming language comes in. Now, machine language is a low-level programming language. It is a programming language, trust me, it is a programming language, but it is a low-level programming language. Now, programming languages like Python, Java, they are high level programming language. So these are the programming language that comes in between our natural language and the machine language. So they are those ones that serve as a bridge between we programmers and the computer. So now, for you to understand better, we'll go into two key concepts you also come across, which is compilation and interpretation. So Since computer does not understand our language and programming languages that are high level, uh, serving as the bridge to bridge the gap of communication between we humans and computer. This brings about compilation and interpretation. Now, some programming language uses compilation, while others use what interpretation. So there are differences between the usage of this, right? So programming languages that uses compilation, we'll look at the advantage and the disadvantage of each of them. So when we talk about compilation, now compilation usually converts all codes. Compilation usually converts all code into machine language before it sends it to a computer for execution. For example, when you are working with, let me say, when you're working on Windows operating system and you are programming in, let me say, C++, for example, C++, it uses compiler. It doesn't interpret. You understand? It doesn't do interpretation, but rather it uses what compiler. So when you're working on Microsoft, when you're working on Windows operating system, sorry, so you usually end up with what we call a .exe file. That's after the compilation has been done, right? It gives you an executable code, a executable application. So and when you run this application, you see your outputs, right? So one of the key things about compilation is that it is fast, right? Because you get to compile the code once, then you can just execute your file, right? Which makes it super fast. This is why I think C++ are always good for C and C++ are always good for embedded systems. Yeah, they are kind of good for embedded systems. So interpretation, on the other hand, converts some part of the code, right? It does not convert all the code at once. It just takes like some lines of instructions, and give the instruction into a machine language, then send it to the computer for what execution. So it will keep repeating this same process until all instructions are covered. So now, interpretation makes it really easy to identify errors, and this is simply because it allows us to see exactly where the error occur, right? For example, we say that interpretation it takes each line, like each instructions, run it and execute it, right? So even if you have, let me say, 10 lines of code, for example, split into four with different instructions, it's if there's an error in, let me say, line 5, you see the line 4, sorry, you see the output of 1 to 3 first. You understand? So it runs the first instruction, it runs the second one, it runs the third one, and you will see your output. But when it gets to the fourth one, it will now show you what error. So this easily allows us to what spot errors in what our program. So, but for compilation, it's a little bit difficult because if there is an error in your program, it won't even run, right? So that's what crazy thing about compiled programs. It won't run if there's an error. So you won't see, it makes it a little bit difficult for you to know where the error is actually coming from. So, example of programming language that uses compiler, as I've said before, is C and C++. And for interpreters, we have Python, Perl, among others. So now, I've said it, compiler results in an executable file. So we just skip this and just go straight to the next slide. So we'll be looking at Python as a programming language, right? I think this part is really important for people who don't have knowledge about tech, right? Most non-tech enthusiasts, they probably see Python as a snake, but rather it is not a snake. Python is a high-level object-oriented programming language. During the progress of this course, we get into what we call object-oriented programming. So you know more about that later on in the course. So now Python as a programming language originates from the old BBC television comedy sketch series called Monty Python's Flying Circus. So the person who created, the man whose idea brought about Python is the man called Guido van Rossum. So even though he created Python, even though the idea of Python came from him, Python is an open source. A lot of people have contributed greatly to the development of Python, not just him, but the beginning. Everything is just attributed to him because he started the whole idea of Python. But a lot of people have contributed greatly to the development of this programming language called Python. So Python is easy. It is used in filtering of files in computer. This is why it is called a scripting language. So Python is also a scripting language. JavaScript is also a scripting language. You understand? So these are programming languages that can be used to perform short programs. Like automating tasks, renaming files, web scraping. Python is good in that. So we'll move further to basically Python 2 and Python 3. These are versions of Python. So Python 2 is an old version, while Python 3 is the latest version. If you go to python.org, you see probably Python 3 point whatsoever. I don't know what the current version is for Python, but it's going to be Python 3 point something. So one of the key things you need to understand about these two versions of Python is that there's incompatibility issues, in the sense that if you have an application that you've programmed in Python 2, it is difficult. It won't work on Python 3 environment, right? So you have to probably rewrite the code, which is not even advisable, because if you have large projects, it's really difficult for you to try to convert everything from Python 2 to Python 3. So if you have an existing project out there on Python 2, it's best you just leave it that way, unless you have the time and energy to do that. So there are different versions of Python based on implementation, right? Based on implementation. And we're looking at CPython, you call it Cython. We have JPython, PyPy, MicroPython, and Ion Python. So throughout this course, what we are going to be using is the CPython, right? This is conventional Python you get when you go to python.org and you try to download Python. You get a CPython. That's what you're going to get. So CPython is written in C programming language. I think that's probably why they call it CPython. So, but for JPython, now JPython is kind of used to integrate with what existing Java application, right? When you have a Java application and you want to make use of Python, you use what we call JPython. You won't use the CPython. So for the PyPy simply refers to Python inside of Python. When you try to program make let me say programs that are used to create other Python files, right? Other Python programs also. So I think you mostly see this in, let me say, web development. Yeah, you see this in web development, whereby people create applications that are used in web development for Python developers. So MicroPython, on the other hand, is designed for microcontrollers and embedded systems, right? I know you. When we get to limitations, you see that all these are not really a strong side of Python, right? Python is not really good for embedded systems anyway. But I don't know. So I don't know why they just have it here. So Iron Python allows the integration of Python with .NET frameworks, right? You need to understand that because all these are possible does not really make it, good. You understand? You can just, integrate, but they can't stand alone, right? You can't just wake up and say you want to use Python from scratch to design an embedded system or microcontrollers. I don't think that's going to work well for you, right? You're going to be needing programming language like C++ and C for that. So we look at the limitations of Python as a programming language. Whatsoever have an advantage has a disadvantage, right? So Python is good for web development. Yeah, it's good for machine learning, artificial intelligence, and all. But one of the downside of Python is that it is not good for mobile development. Yeah, Python is not good for mobile development, and this is because of its high resource consumption. So Python requires high resource to function, and I think because it is an interpreted language. It takes a lot of time, to keep interpreting lines of code over and over again. It's not like compilation, whereby everything is just compiled once and not get to do that again. So this is all about the limitations of Python. You can go to the web and check more and read more about it. So next, we are going to be downloading and installing Python on our machine, right? If you're using mobile phone, I'll make a video on how to get yourself started. And if you're working on Windows operating system, I'll make a video on how to get us started. If you're working on Linux, I'll also make a video on how to get us started. So thank you. I think that's all for now.